to my computer and I will be able to download it. Okay, so for today we're going to start with, we're going to look at the Spanish Empire first. Since Spain, with Columbus sailing for them, discovered the Americas first, and they were the global power at the time. And so they began to send explorers, and we will look at how their empire expanded, and even before the British started founding colonies in the northeast part of North America, the Spanish had a great influence and presence in mostly Central and South America, but also in North America. Excuse me for 1 second as I get some other things brought up here. All right. So let me put up some of the Spanish explorers for you to see. And I want to touch on a few of these. You see there Cortez at the bottom of this list. But he was one of the earlier Spanish explorers. And he conquered the Aztecs in Mexico during 1519 through 1521. Pizarro, a couple of years later, 1531 to 1533, explored the Pacific coast on in Central and South America, and eventually conquered, destroyed the Incas. So we're seeing how the Spanish Empire is branching out into Central America, going down into South America. One second, excuse me, I'm looking for one more picture. All right, and so you can see some others there that are mentioned that we're going to get to, but wanted to focus on those two explorers and establishing the Spanish presence in Central and South America. We're going to talk a little bit here in a little bit about the Great Exchange or the Columbian Exchange. And this slide mentions how did they destroy such huge empires with a lot less men. And of course, we know they had a more advanced technology. They had horses, but also as we look at the Columbian Exchange, the Europeans brought several diseases with them from Europe that the indigenous people did not have an immunity built up to fight things like the smallpox and the influenza, typhus, and other things. So that was part of how they were able to conquer and eventually wipe out these massive civilizations. Any questions And just to let you know, we'll go to about 10:15, take a break, 5-minute break, and then come back and finish up. Okay. Now, we want to focus a little bit more on the Spanish presence in North America. And it started with Ponce de Leon, who was governor of Puerto Rico. But in 1513, he sails to Florida in search for gold. And you've probably heard, of course, also in search of the Fountain of Youth. He came to Florida, claimed it for Spain. Florida means Feast of Flowers. And he started on the kind of the north part of Florida on the coast and just sailed down the Atlantic coastline of Florida around the southern tip. He went a little bit farther north on the Gulf of Mexico side, and then he went back to Puerto Rico. So he really didn't go much into the interior of Florida. And let me pull up a map real quick. Or hold on a second. Is that map too hard to see? Too far away for you? What was that? Okay. So, we have Pizarro coming down here, conquering the Incas. Cortez here, conquering the Aztecs. And so as we move to North America, Puerto Rico's over here, and this is where Ponce de Leon goes. Then we want to talk about De Soto, who traveled in the interior of Southeast America, and he discovered the Mississippi River, so he was in these areas here, De Soto. And then we have Coronado, who explored the southwest region of the United States and even was in our state in the Panhandle area for a little bit. And so as these explorers moved across the southern section of our continent, they basically claimed this as Spanish territory. Now, what were they looking for as they explored in these areas of the southern part of the United States? Were they looking for crops?
They're looking for gold.
Looking for gold, that's right. Gold, the cities of gold. You know, nobody found it until Benjamin Gates in National Treasure 2. We're looking for the cities of gold, and they didn't find it. But what they did do instead, since they didn't find all these valuable treasures of wealth, they established outposts, and eventually, since they weren't going to find all these great materials that would make them rich, they used these outposts to establish churches, Catholic churches, and they basically began a an extensive missionary outreach to the native peoples. Places like San Francisco, Santa Fe, and several other cities that we can see the Spanish influence in their name became basically missionary outposts. New Mexico was founded as a royal colony of Spain, and Santa Fe was built and eventually became the capital of what was called New Mexico. And so before Jamestown was founded, you know, the English, not the first English colony, but the one that is the first one to still be surviving today, established in 1607, Santa Fe had already been established, and around the time of Jamestown starting to grow, became the capital of the new territory of Mexico, the New Mexico area. But even before New Mexico was founded, there's another city. You turn the light back this way. There's another city that's founded in 1565, which is the oldest European settlement on the North American continent. Does someone know what city that is? It is St. Augustine, Florida. We talked about Ponce de Leon exploring the coasts of Florida and basically claimed Florida as a Spanish territory. And while there was more explorers who came for Spain, they kind of abandoned Florida around 1562. And some French explorers. Now, even though Spain is the main country that is expanding their empire during this time, the French and the English and the Dutch had started to send an explorer or two. And some of the French explorers came into Florida and established a fort around 1563. Well, when the Spanish saw that, they went back in, and they sent a guy by the name of Pedro Menendez de Avilés to go in and kind of drive the French back out, and he established St. Augustine, Florida, first as an outpost, as a fort, but it's the oldest surviving European city in our continent today, 1565. So that's a good 42 years before Jamestown. So they found little gold, no lost cities, but plenty of native peoples. So the plan switched to convert the natives to Catholicism and also impose Spanish culture on the natives. And this they did for several years until 1680, when a native leader by the name of Pope led a Pueblo revolt against the Spanish in the New Mexico area. And this is of significance because it is one of the major, if not the major, Native American victory over Europeans during this time of colonization. And even through the westward move, where European Americans continue to break treaties with Native Americans, take over their land, push them out. And of course, the Native Americans resisted, and there were several wars. But this defeat of the Spanish in 1680 by Pope and his men was probably the most significant Native American victory against the Europeans. And this is something you probably need to know for the test. A key result was Pope and his people obtaining over 100 Spanish horses. And if you recall, the Native Americans did not have horses before this. They hunted on foot. They used dogs to track. But with this victory over the Spanish, they were able to obtain over 100 Spanish horses. And then these pueblos started to trade with other tribes. And, you know, within a generation or so, many of the Native American tribes had become skilled warriors on horseback. And so that was a very significant thing about this Native American victory in 1680. And as tribes obtained horses and started to use them, they had improved warfare amongst each other. They were more effective hunters. And with horses, it decreased the work burden of other animals, as well as the Native American women who did most of the work. So any question on the Spanish Empire and how it expanded? And again, this by 1650, they had all the way down to Chile. So pretty much the whole west coast of South America, Central America, and then the southern portion of North America or the United States. All before British colonies were planted in the Northeast. So any questions on that? Let's talk about the Columbian Exchange for a little bit, or the Great Exchange. Let me turn my map around. Had to go down into my hobbit hole today and get some maps. You can laugh, it's okay. Okay, I also have a smaller map. Here's a little summary of the Spanish exploration. And you'll want to know these 5 things for the test. The Spanish brought the building of cities, started universities, their style of government, Catholicism, and a different social class structure. And then there you can see their influence. Oh, I'll leave that up there a little bit more if you need to get those 5 things. Any questions? You will need to know also Coronado, Cortez, actually, I'm sorry, Coronado and De Soto in Ponce de Leon. And again, Coronado explored the southwest region. De Soto, the southeast region, discovered the Mississippi River. Coronado discovered the Grand Canyon and Buffalo. Ponce de Leon discovered Florida and explored that coastline of it. Are we good to move on? Everybody have this? All right, here is the Columbian Exchange. Let me zoom it in a little bit more for you. Sometimes are also called the Great Exchange. And so in coming to the Americas, the Europeans brought several fruits and vegetables, other staples, livestock, honeybees, these flowers. And then, unfortunately, but unintentionally, these diseases. And it wiped out many Native Americans because they had no immune system to these diseases. Bringing back from the Americas, the Europeans received in exchange all of these fruits and vegetables, flowers, plants. What's significant about corn again? Anybody? Corn was significant in the Americas for?
It was the staple crop.
Right. It was the main crop of virtually almost all of the indigenous people. Turkeys. And there was one disease that was not in Europe that came from here, and that was syphilis. Came from the Americas to Europe. So any question on the Columbian or the Great Exchange? There will be a question on the test about this. You will not have to list all of these, but probably 3 to 5 of the plants and animals and a few of the diseases. And know that that time frame is 150 years from 1492, which is Columbus, right? Our first contact, into the 1640s. So anybody have a question on the Great Exchange? All righty. we will look at the defeat of the Spanish Armada and then take our break. And we want to kind of use this as a transition point from focusing on the Spanish Empire to focusing on the British Empire. And that will then lead us into the beginning of the English colonies in the northeast section of North America. So one of the reasons Spain was the world empire at the time was, anybody want to take a stab at it? I kind of already gave you a hint.
Because of their navy.
You say because of their navy?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, they had a great navy, the Spanish Armada, made up of 130 ships, thousands of sailors, and so they were quite formidable as the naval power. But in 1588, the Great Spanish Armada was defeated by the English Navy. The English had smaller ships that could travel faster. They were more agile. And that was definitely a plus as they went to war in 1588, but there was also a fortuitous natural weather phenomenon that helped them defeat the Spanish Armada as they were chasing after them through the English Channel. The Spanish Armada came into the North Sea, and a great storm devastated them, swept the majority of these ships out to the sea and destroyed many, many of their ships. And so this was a victory that propelled the English to be the naval power on the planet at that time. And so this victory over the Spanish Armada emboldened England to expand their exploration, because we mentioned earlier they did have a few explorers during the Spanish dominance, but when the Armada was defeated, this really emboldened the English royalty to send out more explorers and to claim territory for the mother country. So any questions on that? 1588 is probably a good date to remember because of the significance in the balance of which European country would be dominant at that point. It hurt Spain. Although they had a great presence already in the Americas, it would hurt them and have an effect from this point on. All right, no questions? Anything that maybe you need cleared up that we went over? All right, well, let's take a 7-minute break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the lost colony of Roanoke. And we have a video about that too that we'll watch. So back at 10:14. All righty, let us turn our attention now to the English exploration of the new land or the new world, and they're beginning to establish colonies in the Northeast. I want to touch on the first attempt at the English founding a colony, but now is lost, the lost colony of Roanoke. And here is Roanoke Island, which is in modern times off the coast of North Carolina. Virginia's just a little bit north. I think I have, yeah, here's a kind of a little map to show you today where Roanoke is in comparison to North Carolina and to the Jamestown colony of Virginia. But Sir Walter Raleigh led this expedition, and he called this area Virginia in honor of the Queen, who was not married at the time. But she gave him the go-ahead to explore in 1584. So that's before, a little bit before the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And he sent his first expedition there in 1585. And this was a group of about 100 men, soldiers, living on this island. And the way the island is situated, as you saw down here, there's kind of a barrier piece of land between the island and the sea. So this is not the best place in light of storms, hurricanes, things like that. So life there was very hard for those 100 men, and most of them left in 1586, or they did leave. In 1587, Raleigh sent another expedition, or another group, led by John White, and they did found another colony there. This time they had 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children. So 118 of them total. And John White was the appointed governor of Roanoke settlement. While he was still there, his daughter Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. So that would be John White's granddaughter, and her name was Virginia Dare, D-A-R-E, the first English person born on the North American continent. So after Virginia was born, the granddaughter, John White, he journeyed back to England to get supplies and things like that. And we've already seen what happened in 1588. England went to war with Spain. And it wasn't just the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but the war continued through 1589. And so John White was prevented from coming back until 1690. And when he came back in 1690, everybody was gone. Now, there was no signs that they had to leave in a haste. There was no signs of warfare. So there's really no, we really don't know what happened to him. And the video we're going to watch here in a moment will share 5 theories about what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. The only thing that John White and his men found was on a plank that was part of the fortification, they found the word Croatoan. And there was also another tree that had CRO. And so John White and his men, they believed that the Roanoke settlers moved south about 20 miles, and there was an island where a tribe called the Croatoans were, or Croatans. So John White believed that that's what happened to them. But before he could go before he could go down there to that island and see, a great storm came in and he had to leave and go back to England. And it wasn't until 1602 that Sir Walter Raleigh sent another expedition to search for the lost colonists. So we're going to look at now 5 theories, but we're going to watch it on a video. It's about a 13-minute video. So make sure you got your volume turned up. And any questions though before we look at that? All right, let me know if you can't hear it.
Hello and welcome to All Top Fives. If you've been watching season 6 of American Horror Story, you'll know that a central theme is the Roanoke colony disappearance in 1587. This was an entire settlement of English people that was founded in what was to become North Carolina, USA, and which disappeared mysteriously. There are several theories as to how this could have happened, including American Horror Story's paranormal take on it, but we still don't know truly what did occur. Number 5. Croatoan. In 1585, a colony of 108 men was established on Roanoke Island and visited by the famous Sir Francis Drake as he returned home to England after a successful raid of the Caribbean. Soon after, a fleet of boats arrived at the site of the Roanoke colony with supplies and more men. They found the settlement deserted. In light of this, in 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh ordered a new group of colonists to change their plans and instead travel via Roanoke to find out what had happened. They too found nothing and decided to settle all 115 colonists on that same site, presumably as it was already built up. John White, whose granddaughter was the first English person born in America, planned a supply run from England and set out for Roanoke. He was delayed because of the war with Spain. After several attempts, he finally arrived 3 years later in 1590, only to find the entire settlement once again completely abandoned, with no sign of any person, struggle, or battle. There was just one clue that White had found. Carved into the side of a stockade post was the word Croatoan. All buildings had been dismantled, as if there had been no hurry in leaving the camp. White had told the colonists to carve a Maltese cross on a tree if they were leaving against their will, but he found none. Thus, he assumed that they had moved to the nearby Croatoan island, but had to abandon his search because of a huge storm, and had to return home with no answers. A massive investigation in 1998 into the Roanoke disappearance uncovered several signs of 16th and 17th century habitation. The only piece of evidence from this ancient settlement on Croatoan Island with any connection to Roanoke was a gold signet ring. Its crest was a lion, similar to that of the Kendall coat of arms, and this led investigators to believe that it may have belonged to a colonist, Master Kendall, as there were records of this man living in the first colony that disappeared in 1586. It's a tenuous link, but there could be some truth to it. But if the entire Roanoke colony that had disappeared had indeed moved over to Croatoan Island, why isn't there vastly more evidence of their settlement there, either in archaeological terms or in the records or paintings or anything? The investigation continues.
Everybody hear it okay? Okay.
Number 4, drought. Also in 1998, David Stahl, climatologist, and Dennis Blanton, archaeologist, conducted their own investigation into the Roanoke area, hoping to try and explain the mystery of the lost colony. They took samples of 800-year-old cypress trees from Roanoke Island and examined the core tree rings to reconstruct a picture of what the rains and temperatures were like year on year. They came to the conclusion that the worst drought in 800 years occurred for the 3 years from 1587 to 1589, precisely over the summer when the lost colony arrived and disappeared from Roanoke Island. They built up maps that confirmed this drought covered all of southeast United States, and its most extreme point was in the Roanoke region. Indeed, the colonists would have struggled to grow food in the new land, and had been expecting a relief fleet the following year with fresh supplies, which never came. The researchers believed, therefore, that it was likely that nearby tribes may have raided the settlement for food because of the drought, and that the lost colony may have up and left for Croatoan Island, or elsewhere as a result. Unfortunately, this theory only gives us one picture of why the colony may have left, not certainty of why or where they went to. Still, it's one more piece of the puzzle that is as yet incomplete. Number 3, Powhatan Slaughter. A later settlement in 1607 called Jamestown up in Virginia attempted to get answers regarding the lost colony 20 years before from the local Powhatan tribe. John Smith, leader of the Jamestown colony, questioned the chief of the Powhatan tribe and was shocked when the chief claimed full responsibility for the slaughter of the entire Roanoke colony. He relayed this news back to England, and King James and his court were convinced. In 1610, Jamestown secretary William Strachey wrote the history of travail into Virginia Britannia, documenting the success of colonizing what was to become Virginia. His reports confirmed the Powhatan's involvement in the disappearance, allegedly explaining the reason for the slaughter. The Roanoke colonists, according to Strachey, lived peacefully amongst the Chesapeake natives on the island for 20 years. But Chief Powhatan seems to order the slaughter of all these natives and colonists because of a prophecy from his priests that they would rise up and be the downfall of the Powhatan tribe. This is obviously a contradiction, as it suggests that the massacre occurred in around 1607, and the colony had already been reported missing 20 years before. Although for centuries this explanation was accepted as the reason for the lost colony's disappearance, both Smith's and Strachey's reports were re-examined, And with other evidence, they are now both thought to be referring to two entirely different massacres by the Powhatan tribe, neither of which would have involved the 1587 lost Roanoke colony. One more piece of supposed evidence came to light in the late 1930s, or rather 48 pieces. One stone was discovered by a Californian tourist, and 47 more stones were discovered thereafter by a local farmer, all of which appear to have been written by Eleanor Dare, daughter of John White and mother to the first English child born in the Americas, if you remember, and member of the Roanoke colony. These stones were addressed to John White, Eleanor's father. The first one read, Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence unto heaven, 1591. Any Englishman shew John White governor via. And on the reverse it said that all but 7 colonists had been killed by savages. The later stones found by the farmer requested revenge against the so-called savages and described the exodus of the lost colony from the original site to a sanctuary in Nakuchi Valley with a local tribe. Although thought to be authentic at first, the stones have been scrutinized by experts over the decades, and the 47 from the local farmer have been decided that they are most likely forgeries, etched with a drill press. However, many do believe that the original stone was genuine and that the slaughter described was likely what had happened, much like the evidence from Smith and Strachey. But it doesn't explain the inconsistencies with the Powhatan tribe, and it doesn't account for the dismantling of houses, lack of signs of a battle, and no trace whatsoever found of any members of the lost colony. Number 2. Virginia Parr's map. Possibly the most mysterious clue of all, this map was drawn up by John White when he first visited Roanoke Island in 1585. It has been kept in the British Museum in London since 1866. In 2011, a study of the map by historians revealed that 2 areas of this map had been patched over. This patching was done around the time the map was made, as the paper was the same type. It couldn't be removed, of course, but the museum investigated in other ways. When viewed on a light box, you can see through beneath the patches, and under one of them lies a big symbol, a large square with long, pointed corners, containing a similar shape of a different colour within. It's not really a symbol seen before on maps such as this, and was presumed by many to represent a fort, probably. This has led many historians to suggest that the Roanoke colonists may have relocated to this new location. What is the symbol supposed to be? And why did John White cover it up to obscure it soon after including it on his map? Is it credible that it might represent a planned fort that was cancelled? And is it credible that, for whatever reason, the lost colony members relocated to it? This discovery led to new excavations of the area and further study of artifacts previously recovered from around there. But so far, there's no evidence of the Roanoke colonists. It suddenly leaves questions unanswered, and the investigations into the mysterious supposed fort continue. Number 1. Integration. One popular theory for the disappearance of the Roanoke colony states that, for whatever reason, they abandoned the settlement and integrated into the local tribes. That is, they settled down and lived with them until the end of their days. There are many bits of evidence, I suppose you'd call it, for this. In 1607, a map drawn by one of the Jamestown settlers, Francis Nelson, reads that a group of 4 men wearing clothing settled down in this area on the map, and originally came from Roanoke. Indeed, the documenter William Strachey wrote that there were supposedly 2-story houses built with stone walls in that area, and that the locals had learned how to build them from the Roanoke colonists. A century later, in 1709, John Lawson wrote in his work A New Voyage to Carolina that tribespeople on Croatoan Island, now Hatteras Island, told him of white ancestors. Confirmation of this we have from the Hatteras Indians, who either then lived on Roanoke Island or much frequented it. These tell us that several of their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book, as we do, the truth of which is confirmed by grey eyes being found frequently amongst these Indians, and no others. It is probable that this settlement miscarried for want of timely supplies from England. This suggests the Roanoke tribe may have relocated to Croatoan Island while desperately awaiting that supply fleet, as many other pieces of evidence point to as well. In the late 1880s, a family of Native American descendants in Robeson County claimed that their ancestors were members of the Roanoke colony. Their family names were the same as those officially recorded from the 1580s, and they used words in their language that bore incredible similarity to English words from that time, but used no longer. Gradually, more and more tribes started to claim to have Roanoke blood in their populations, and the issue became clouded. In 2007, the Lost Colony of Roanoke DNA Project was founded by a private company working through historical records and DNA testing in an attempt to solve the mystery. So far, there haven't been any revelations. This integration theory could very well be true for those few, but what happened to the majority of the colony? Most of these theories assume that the few who integrated into these tribes were survivors of some attack, an assumption that is shaky, as I've already covered. So could tribal integration be the answer? Or is there something else that we just don't understand yet? And that's it from All Top 5s for this week. It's a really interesting topic, kind of a...
Okay. So here's some of those theories. Some of them on this list were not mentioned in the video, like the disease or the violent storm. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe some of you can help us out here. Isn't there a whole series on the History Channel about this? Roanoke Island or something? Anyway, any questions on this lost colony? Okay, we got a few minutes, so we're going to jump into Jamestown, and this will be our beginning into the British settlements that would be planted in the next 40 years. So let me get my little map up again. And again, you can see that this colony is a few miles north of the Lost Colony. And Jamestown, founded in 1607. So it would be the oldest English town still in existence today. The oldest town in North America is what again, by which culture, which empire?
It was St. Augustine.
Yep, St. Augustine, founded by the
Spaniards.
Spanish, yes. Has anybody out there been to St. Augustine or Jamestown? I was at St. Augustine years ago. I think that's the first place I had shrimp, and it's good. Okay, little bonus there for you. Anyway, so it was founded in 1607 with about 100 men and boys. Similar to the first colony here, except it was all men. And this Jamestown, it's about 40 miles inland up this body of water, and it was founded in some very marshy, swampy land. A lot of mosquitoes. And being swampy, it wasn't the most conducive to hunting and gathering and things like that. So after the first 9 months, the population dwindled down to 38. And it wasn't just because they had a hard time finding food. Many of the men were nobility, and they felt like work was beneath them. And many of them were townspeople, and they didn't know how to farm. And so within 9 months, you had, over 60 of the people die. And before I forget, Jamestown Colony was founded by the Virginia Company. England, their colonies were founded differently than the Spanish colonies. All of the Spanish colonies were royal colonies. The English colonies were founded by private companies called joint stock companies, and people could invest money in a joint stock company, and therefore several people who made up the Virginia Company founded Jamestown. So it wasn't just a royal colony. This was, somebody say something? This was founded by private individuals. And if it went under, no one individual had pretty much invested all their money in it. It was a joint stock company. So 38 were left, and upon the scene, or one of the men was a Captain John Smith. Probably heard of him. And he led the colony to survive. He was a military leader, and he enforced that everyone had to work or they wouldn't eat. So that was good, and helped them through 1608. But then the winter of 1609, 1610 is called the starving time, when it was very, very bad weather conditions, and crops were not growing, and the colonists got desperate, started to eat their livestock, including horses, ate their dogs, their cats. If they could catch some rodents, they would eat them. And it even had degenerated to one man killing his wife and eating her. So some cannibalism during this starving time. Is there a question there?
No.
All right. But they survived through this time. And in 1612, a man by the name of John Rolfe grew a crop of tobacco. This is in 1612. And he was able to export a lot of it back to England. And tobacco, the crop of tobacco, which had been discovered, and the Europeans liked smoking. This became kind of the saving grace of this colony, the crop of tobacco. became their staple crop. So the colony turned around and rebounded in 1618. The head of the Virginia Company, a guy by the name of Sir Edwin Sandys, established a new policy called what was called headright. This was basically a land grant that any English person who put money in the company and came over to Virginia would receive 50 acres of land. And then if they had servants who came over, they would receive 50 more acres. And so that helped more settlers come over from England. And so from the 1607 founding until 1624, so a 17-year period, I believe it was about 14,000 English men, women, children had come over to Virginia. But only 1,100 were still living in 1624. So while things had improved, it still wasn't the easiest of situations. Then in 1619, you'll want to know that year, 1619. Several things were significant that we want to mention for this Jamestown colony. First of all, under the political leadership of Edwin Sandys, every settler in Jamestown would have the same rights as Englishmen back in England. So these colonists enjoyed the same rights. And also in 1619, July 30th to be exact, the first General Assembly of Virginia was set up. Now, one of the things that we need to understand as we talk about Virginia being established, Virginia, of all the English colonies, was most like England. Matter of fact, as Virginia was being set up, it was considered to be a New England. Now, it was never officially called that, but the original settlers and those that came in during that first 2 decades were considering it to be a New England. And it was very, very similar to society in England. Now, we know that Virginia eventually was a part of the South. And the official place that was designated New England was Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and that area. But originally, this is what Virginia was looked upon as. And while we understand that Spain and France and many of the other European countries, they had a certain type of social order. You know, kings were above nobles, priests were above commoners, nobles were above priests, and you didn't get out of those orders. England was a little bit different, and we need to understand this as we look at the development of Virginia. You might want to draw a triangle on your paper, on your notes, and this will kind of help you understand the ladder or the hierarchy, the social organization of England. So if you made a triangle, at the very top point, you'd put the king. Now, above the king not touching the triangle would be God, their belief in God. Now, one of my college professors, he said that in between God and the king, you would have Elvis, but I don't know that I buy that. Y'all with me? Okay, good. So underneath the king, about a quarter of a way down, you would have the nobles. And the nobles, they were nobles by bloodline, by heredity. And in England, the nobles were not under the king like maybe the Spanish nobles were under the Spanish king. The nobles were really an advisory board to the king. And among the nobles, so this is still, you might just put this in parentheses next to nobles, put the gentry, Gentry. The nobles were more of your higher, your higher ups in the nobility. The gentry were more of your high-ranking gentlemen who had money, but they were more apt to be clergy or lawyers, university students. And so they were still in that nobility, but they were just a notch below the wealthy landowners. And here's what you need to know about the noble and the gentry. And I'm sorry, I know we're almost done. The noblemen ran the society, but the gentry ran the country. In other words, the noblemen, they had all the pomp and circumstance. They had to hold to the forms and the ceremonies and the rituals, which communicated to the common people, we are nobility. They had to know how to impress people. They would put on hunting parties. They had big houses to entertain. They had to cultivate and practice an elite lifestyle. So they ran the society, but it was really the gentry who ran the country. All right, very quickly, and I'll go back over these first thing Thursday. Underneath the nobles, you would have the yeomen, Y-E-O-M-E-N. These are your merchants and tradesmen. They had the right to vote, but they rarely held office. They were also prosperous farmers. Then underneath the yeomen, you had the serfs and peasants. And a serf usually only had to serve about 7 years, and then they were granted their freedom, and they had rights after that. Underneath the serfs and peasants, you had slaves, and they had no rights. So this is the social structure of England, and this is, Virginia was probably the colony that most closely resembled England. Eventually, around 1640, with tobacco, the crop growing so greatly in Jamestown, you had this elite planter class that began to dominate Virginia. And that's going to be very important when we come to the Revolutionary time. All right, so there's a couple more things about 1619. I'll get to them Thursday morning because it's time to go. Any questions before we say goodbye? All right, very quickly, Latrice and Madison, if you all can stick around, and we'll talk about arranging for you to get a copy of her notes, okay? So this is recorded. I'll have it up on the page if you want to go back over it anytime, and we'll see you Thursday morning. Thank you. And make sure, all of you except Smithville, make sure you tell your supervisor, counselor, that I did email the syllabus to you. And did anybody try to access the class while during this time?
Muldrow still doesn't have access.
Okay.
Have your attention. Today we will do.
Okay, so what would be easiest for you to do, or what would be easiest, Madison, if she just made copies and emailed them as an attachment, or faxed it to Mrs. Faulkner, or?
An email would be better.
What's that?
Email would be better.
Okay, so can you do that for her, Latrice? Make copies and then email them as an attachment? And can you guys see each other? So do you want to give her your email? Or do you want to have her send it to Mrs. Faulkner?
Give her your email. That's all we know. She's going to chat with her.
Okay. Thanks for being willing to do that.